Welcome back. Today we are talking with Ralph Kliem, the author of Management Lessons from the Great Explorers, his new book. And I just want to recap our first three lessons learned. Have a strong sponsor, rely on data and information, apply risk management. And now let's start with number 4, adapt to changing circumstances.
Adapting to changing circumstances is the life of everybody nowadays, right? And so both in business and in private life, because things are changing so dramatically. Well, these explorers that I'm going to talk about briefly, I've already mentioned their names. They're two prime examples of that. And the first one, of course, is Meriwether Lewis and William Clarke. Talk briefly about them as they were going through from one side of the continent to the other side. They dealt with all sorts of changing conditions. They went from it, just for an example, they went through relatively pleasant weather to very harsh weather up in northern Idaho to Bitterroot Mountains and Montana up there, all the way to Columbia, down the Columbia River. And then they settled in Oregon at Fort Stop or something like that, if I pronounced it right. And it's they had to adapt. They got low on food. They dealt with some of their councils, which were set up to try to get the Indian tribes to all work together, which was no easy matter. And for the most part, it didn't work. And then they had to adapt to dealing with the Sioux Indians. And all these presented challenges, and they had to adapt on how they dealt with those type of challenges. And it was extremely difficult. The other one is, of course, Ernest Shackleton. Again, he dealt with a circumstance where the Endurance got crushed, right? And then he had his crew. And basically the bottom line is he had to take that crew. They went through a lot of morale problems. There was hostility, anger was erupt. And having led troops up in the really cold winter Alaska many years ago, it affects people's attitude and their morale. And there's always this tension. And so I can only imagine how Shackleton dealt with the difficulties because, the dark nights for long periods of time can really affect people. And so it's a tremendous challenge. And he had to adapt to get from point A to point Z to get these people rescued. And it was, so he had to adapt to those changing circumstances too. Now, another gentleman, and I didn't put it in the last chapter, but it comes to mind is Hernan Cortez. Now, he was a perfect example of, not the most gracious fella in the world. I guess he was actually gracious back in that time and very intelligent and was quite a risk taker, but he was very brutal. Right. And everybody was motivated in those days practically by the three things of God, gold, and glory. Right. And so he was after gold. So they were all after gold. And but he had to deal with all these tribes again. Right. That in Mexico, as I'm using Mexico now in the context of the name today. Right. And so there was a lot of tension there. He had to deal with hostile tribes, getting alliance with some of those tribes because the Aztecs were very brutal on some of those tribes for sacrifices, etc. But he had to adapt as well during those circumstances, and that took a lot of skill, and it also took a lot of moxie to go for where he wanted. Now, he had the goal of getting gold, but he was willing to do what he had to do. Plus, he had the governor of Cuba after his butt too, because after he sent him off, the governor of Cuba said, I picked the wrong guy to go on this expedition, and knew he couldn't control him. So Cortez adapted well. Another guy, and I thought was very highly of, is George Vancouver. And of course, George Vancouver, where I live, is an esteemed gentleman out here, and he adapted extremely well. Back to what I just mentioned, a side note, the data and information he had to deal with was very limited, and he did an outstanding job. And of course, George Vancouver learned his lessons, I guess, dealing with Hawaiians when he served under James Cook. So anyway, back to the adapting. Those three gentlemen were, I think, good examples of how to adapt. So if you want to learn how to adapt, those are good examples. Because you got to think sharp. And anybody who's managed projects or managed groups, they know they got to adapt, because nothing stays static.
I was just going to say that, the only constant is change.
Yeah.
And I've worked on projects in my lifetime that I don't think any single one of them stayed true to one plan.
Yeah.
Things happen all the way along.
But we used to say in the Army, there's a difference between being flexible and being fluid. So flexible, you can change and adapt. You're still focused on a thing. Fluid, everything just goes in different directions.
Yeah, wherever it goes.
So
let's go to lessons learned number, 5 now. Identify and understand stakeholders.
Well, I had a number of explorers under that column. The one that I'd like to emphasize, I think, some people would argue whether or not he was an explorer or not, right? But in a way he was, and that's Marco Polo from Venice. He knew, he learned and adapted along the way, but the biggest thing that I was impressed with is he was willing to learn about because the customer is a stakeholder, right?
Yeah.
And so he willing to learn about the Mongols and their culture, and in the people within the Mongol Empire at the time. So he would work with the Chinese, because who were under the purview of Kublai Khan. And he was also he learned their language. And so, it'd be an interesting, I always laugh because you get technical people together, IT people, for instance, not picking on, because I was an IT guy for quite a while, is they would get with the business customer, and throw out a bunch of jargon. They didn't even know what they were talking about, right? And
I've been in those meetings.
Yeah. And the one that used to scare me was their turnkey. We're building a turnkey system. And of course, the customer always goes, hey, I can press all the buttons they want. So anyway, so he knew what was of interest to them. And I know in the travels with Marco Polo, it came under a lot of suspicion at the time that he made this up while he was in prison. He recited it. He didn't actually write it. He had a ghostwriter, and that wrote the book Travels with Marco Polo. But he learned a language. He knew things from the perspective of each of the customers. He knew their everything from their food. He studied their food, what they ate. He knew how, sexual mores and morals, how they treated other people, their views of the world, perspective. He was actually very receptive, and that gained him the confidence of Kublai Khan. And so Kublai Khan trusted him immensely because he was able to stay away from the internal politics too, of identify and understand stakeholders. I think two other gentlemen, I should say, that had a failure of really understanding and appreciating the customer, the stakeholders, was of course Vasco da Gama. He came in, had a host of trinkets and everything else, and then he went, South Africa, at Cape of Good Hope, I think it was,
Yep. Cape Good Hope. Yep.
Yeah. And he went around South Africa, and then he met a whole different clientele, so to speak, of stakeholders. And he was giving them trinkets and beads and hawk's bells and everything else. And they were going, whoa, what is this? He didn't understand them. And these guys, they were Muslim. I'm surprised he just didn't have the trinkets, so to speak, that they give. And they were all disappointed. And then he went to Calicut up there in India, and that caused a big challenge in terms of what he had to offer versus the expectation of the guy was called a Zamorin, which is sort of like, I guess, a version of a sultan or close to it, right? So there was a lot of hostility, disappointments that led to problems with that. And I think the lack of appreciation of those type of stakeholders is very can cause problems. So
Is
if you
that
don't
like
want to learn about, pardon
is
me?
that like trying to treat all stakeholders the same?
Yeah,
Which,
I would
which is
not.
obviously a mistake.
Exactly, they're not all the same. And in the business environment, I can speak with a lot of credibility on this. Is that not all state customers are the same, and especially if you're doing a cross-functional program like I manage for the company I work for. And you get all these different groups and departments. They all have different interests. They view things differently, and they don't gel. Like he assumed, Vasco da Gama assumed that when some of the Hindis came aboard, they got on their knees in front of the gold statue of Virgin Mary. So he assumed right away that they were all Christian. So, it's things that don't let your prejudices and don't let your biases overcome you. And I talked about that in the chapter. So that's one of the lessons.
Now you said there was a third one.
Oh, well, I did. Okay. Let me, I don't want to overtalk it, but George Vancouver was an excellent example. And I don't think I didn't mention him. Who did I mention else?
Well, you did touch on him, and you mentioned that he, I guess, studied would be a word under Cook.
Cook, yeah.
But you didn't really get into so how did he?
He was actually initially up in Alaska, and he was with the Spanish, the guy that was in charge up there. He kind of dumped on the major Indian, I believe a chief up there in the Nuka Sound area. And so, but he was able to work with the Spanish. And then he started working with a lot of what I really found remarkable is he went down and he got the confidence of the Hawaiians when he went back down there. Because he knew, I guess, from his experience with Cook, because he escaped it. He almost got killed himself down there in the Big Island there with the Hawaiians. But he knew and understood them, and he had a very good relationship with King Kamehameha over there in the Honolulu, Oahu. And so he had a good understanding of the different cultures and was willing to learn about them. He understood them. And he did not like the traders, TRADERS, how they treated Hawaiians. And he went after him up in Alaska. And so he was, he understood the culture. He worked very well with the Spanish when there was a lot of tension that existed. Of course, the communication was distant for a long time. I mean, it's not like we have today. We're instantaneous.
Right.
We get information.
I kind of know the answer to this, but I'll ask
Go ahead.
for anyone who might be wondering. Is Vancouver Island named for him?
I believe so. Yeah. But you may know, is that true?
I believe it.
I don't know that, but
I'm trying to remember my history, and I believe that is true. Yes.
Yeah. And so anyway, And he named a whole host of stuff around up here in the Northwest. He got around Mount Rainier, Mount Hood. He did a lot of exploration. And in fact, if I recall correctly, he actually put more nautical miles than Captain Cook did.
Oh, wow.
I think that's what I read. I don't know how true that is, but he was a remarkable guy. I was quite impressed with him. He was a strict disciplinarian, but he probably got that from Cook when Vancouver was a midshipman on under Cook.
So that's lessons learned number 5, identify and understand stakeholders. This last one, I'm interested to hear what you have to say.
Okay.
Lesson learned number 6, and I hope everyone's listening to this one. Be willing to say no.
That is very hard. And I can tell you, I paid a price for it. And I worked, and that's what came to me. I thought, well, what can I learn from these guys? Because I had a very major project, and I was set up for failure. And I said, this is not going to work. Yeah. And I said, I don't want to be on the project unless I get these things. And I got what I wanted, but it led to some hostility, and it will. I mean, no matter how you phrase it, right? But it's an ethical responsibility, right? As a project management tells everybody, you should say no. But you have to come back with a counter proposal. You just don't say, no, I'm not going to do it, right? So the 2 gentlemen that I think stood out, and the first one, that took a lot of guts, and I think is Jacques Cartier. And Jacques Cartier was, of course, from St. Malo in France, and he did a series of expeditions, famous for, the St. Lawrence Seaway up there, and he worked very well with the Indian population in general. You got to remember that there was some controversy, all these explorers, with the native population, and so there's always going to be some tension, right? It's different cultures, different people, different views of the world, but it was his 3rd expedition that was really fascinating, because he sent was it Charlesbourg Royale up there in Canada, had a settlement. So anyway, well, I'm wondering if I'm pronouncing it right. Well, that's where he set up I think it's by Montreal, but I may be wrong. I have to look at my notes, but he set up a settlement. He did some things like put up a cross, which really offended a lot of Indians, because they were saying, hey, this might mean conquest, right? And so he went over on his 3rd expedition, and of course, this time the 3rd one he didn't, but the king Francis I, had gold fever, so he wanted to get gold and gems and those type of things. And so what happened was, he had Jacques Cartier he wasn't the top guy. He had a gentleman named Roberval, or Roberval. I can't, it's French. Sometimes you take off the last consonant, right? And he had a conflict with him. And so Roberval said, you go on your own. So that's where Jacques Cartier went there and put the settlement. Well, the Indians got hostile. And then, of course, Cartier said, I'm not going to stay here. This is dangerous. It killed too many people at the settlement, and they came back, and he was going back to France. Well, I think it was around Newfoundland that he met up with Roberval, and then Roberval said, you need to go back, and you're going back with me. Because he was a typical, I won't say the typical senior guy that said, you go do it, I'll come out. But he never shows up until after the action. And then you shoot the guys that landed on the beach, that didn't make progress. So anyway, and Cartier said, I'm not doing it. I'm going back, and that's it. And so that's what happened. So he said no, and actually he came out ahead. And Francis still liked him because he was politically connected. And so that's the other. And then the other one is again Ernest Shackleton, but he was able to do say no in a different way. He was able to say, no, we're not going to pursue this further, because he was the guy that was responsible for the expedition, but he knew it was in danger. So he didn't pursue going to the South Pole and endangering all these people. He decided to turn around and move and get the people back to safety, so to speak. So that took a lot of courage to take his ego out of the situation where he didn't want to endanger his people.
So we only have 3 minutes left. Do you have any final words on lessons learned or anything you'd like to convey about some of these explorers that you write about in your book?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, just from an explorer standpoint, and also from a personal standpoint, most of these gentlemen, that they all had challenges at first, and they learned from their mistakes, and they learned from their experiences, and they applied that knowledge to future endeavors. And they recognize some of the things that can cause problems on their projects. So experience is very valuable, and we all make mistakes. And these gentlemen all made mistakes, and to a large extent, some of them had mistakes on their last voyages. Christopher Columbus, for instance, James Cook. So that's my biggest takeaway. I would say, learn, create your own lessons learned, and just capitalize on it.
Well, we've come to the end of the show, but before we go, I want to recap our lessons learned from you that you have in your book that we talked about over these 2 segments. Lessons learned: number 1, have a strong sponsor. Number 2, rely on data and information. 3, apply risk management. 4, adapt to changing circumstances. 5, identify and understand stakeholders. And finally, number 6, be willing to say no. And in your book, there are another 7, but I'm not going to give them away. People have to read the book to find out what those other 7 are, with some more great examples that you write about. So, Ralph, thanks very much. I really appreciated this, and congratulations on this book. It's a great read.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope it's of value to whoever reads it, and that's the important thing.
Well, like I said before we actually started recording today, it took me back to some of my high school days in history class, and it was like, wow, I remember that. Oh, yeah. And so that in itself was a great learning experience as well. So congratulations. And, we look forward to the next book, because I know I've had you on before talking about other books. So you'll be back again, I'm sure, for a fifth.
Oh, I'm sure. Whenever. You're pleasant to chat with. Thank you very much.
I don't get that said very often, but thanks very much, Ralph, and everybody listening and watching. Stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.